Hello and welcome to everyone watching at home. In honor of Latino Heritage Month, I wanted to host a talk on Mexican history and culture. And so I spoke with some of the most relevant voices in the area today to help educate everyone at home on this incredible period of history and how the revolution truly sparked a cultural movement. And I am so proud that we've been able to make this collaboration come together from these incredible institutions. So I can't wait to introduce you to everyone. I want you to welcome our panel. I'm going to bring them in, and then they're going to tell you a little bit about the organization they're with. First, I have Crisrobal Cavazos. Cristobal.
It's a pleasure. I'm from Immigrant Solidarity DuPage. Our mission is to educate, organize, and mobilize DuPage County around the rights, culture, and collective struggles of the Latino community. It's a pleasure to be here. Buenas noches.
Thank you. Next, we have Cesáreo Moreno. Cesáreo.
Buenas tardes. My name is Cesáreo, and I work at the National Museum of Mexican Art in the Pilsen neighborhood, where we've been presenting art from Mexico from both sides of the border for about 30 years now, more than 30 years.
Thank you for being here, Cesáreo. Next, we have John Paris from the College of DuPage. John, welcome.
Thank you, and I'm very happy to be here as well. I am a professor at College of DuPage. I'm a professor of history, and one of my key focus areas is Latin American history. I'm also the former and current member of the former chair and current member of the Latin American Studies Committee. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to a good conversation today.
Thank you. And the best for last, Justin Whitty.
Hi, everyone. I'm Justin Whitty, the curator of the Cleve Carney Museum of Art, and I'll be curating the Frida Kahlo Timeless exhibition at the McAninch Art Center and Cleve Carney Museum of Art next summer. Hi, Diana.
So for everyone watching at home, we only have about 100 years of history to cover. So sit back. I'm kidding. We're going to try to keep this to about 45 minutes. We're going to try to give you a little bit of the history, but then think about some of the questions you might have, because at the end of the talk, you have the opportunity to ask questions to this esteemed panel. And we have somebody who's watching the feeds at home. If you're on Facebook, and you can type in your question, and Molly Janokis is on there watching for your questions, and she's going to keep track. So please hang on to your questions, and we're going to answer them at the end. So since we're at the cusp of Mexican Independence Day, I think we should talk a little bit about that and give some context to the Mexican Revolution, right? Because the revolution was really spawned by a lot of incidents that happened 100 years before that. And so I'm going to ask our professor, John, if you could give us a little context into how this all started, the revolution, starting from the secession of Spain.
Okay.
In 5 minutes or less.
I'm going to do my best. 400 years of history, yeah. But it's so there were hundreds, if not thousands, of indigenous societies and nations that occupied North and South America when Cristobal Colon, Christopher Columbus, made landfall in 1492. And shortly thereafter, other people known as los conquistadores, the conquistadors, will conquer many of these societies, and over the next 100 years will very successfully and very brutally conquer societies that were both small and very powerful, including one of the most powerful empires that ever existed in this continent, the Aztec Empire in the Central Valley of Mexico, and many others. And so the land that we call Mexico today was at the heart of a lot of this conquest. There was a lot of mineral resources. Obviously, the conquistadors were looking for things like gold. And so over the next few hundred years, during the colonial period, we see the establishment of a caste system. For those of you that don't really know that term, caste really means being a part of a class, but not a class in society that you've chosen or have earned or disearned. It's something you just happen to be born into. And the three main castes, to simplify it, were white. So if you were white, if you were Spaniard, you occupied the top position in society. You had more opportunities in education. There was the Mestizo class. Mestizo is a word that means people of mixed heritage, right? And there was a growing number of people of mixed heritage, part native and part Spanish or white. And then there were the indigenous people. And the indigenous people, all the way to this day, occupied various areas of society and various areas of Mexico. And these indigenous societies retained to varying degrees much of their heritage and culture and language, but they occupied, in the broader scheme of things, the lowest level of society, and they were brutally oppressed, essentially enslaved for much of this period, various forms of forced labor and oppression. So let's fast forward to the 1800s, only 300 years after what we just talked about. That dynamic of the caste system didn't really change all that much. And a prominent leader will come to power named Porfirio Diaz in 1876. He will become the president of Mexico. And Porfirio Diaz was a general who fought for the armies of Benito Juarez in the fight against France, and he became sort of an icon of a new sort of era of Mexican history. But once he becomes president, he will run Mexico. I always like to describe it much like the machine bosses of that same era, right? Running Mexico, where he will hand out patronage, using the carrot and stick policy, right? For those people that opposed him, the stick. He had some brutal secret police. He inflated the size of his military with modern weaponry and with, just brutality. And that's the stick if you didn't go along with his agenda. If you did go along with his agenda, then you got rewarded. So he doled out a lot of military commissions and land and things of that nature. Also, he was responsible for rapidly, quote unquote, modernizing and industrializing certain parts of Mexico, because he invited a lot of foreign entities into Mexico. And there was sort of a push and pull dynamic. Many foreign entities, the United States, France, Britain, powerful industrial imperialistic nations, didn't need much of an invitation, and Porfirio Diaz gave that to them. So many multinational corporations will glean the resources of Mexico, oil in particular, but many others. And they also built up railroads and roads. And so by the time we get to 1910, he was really sitting over 35 years as essentially a machine boss of a large country for a third of a century with brutality, right? And there was a growing opposition to his rule and to his methods, especially from the lower castes, the people that were the ones that were exploited the most, obviously, that didn't enjoy any of the benefits of porfiriato, which is the term for that period. So there's a growing opposition to him. What launches the Mexican Revolution in 1910 was he runs yet again for re-election. After 35 years, you think he'd get tired, but he says, no, I'm going to run again. And he claims victory in the most fraudulent election in maybe any nation's history. He said it was like, I forget, 95 or 97% voted for him, when the real estimates were he probably lost significantly. So many different, in this period though, there were many different groups that were pushing for and fighting for and desiring more of a stake in society. The oppressed, the indigenous, the workers in factories, especially many of the factories that he helped bring in, that were becoming more unionized and becoming more in tune with the labor movement. Women, the feminist movement is getting its in Mexico, getting its early origins here. Different local leaders wanted more of a share of the national pie, so to speak.
So now we're starting to get where the revolution.
That's where it starts. And so these forces coalesce, and they will launch a war against Porfirio. They will overthrow him in a matter of a few months. By 1911, he flees and he goes to France and lives out the rest of his life in France. But then all these different forces that had been unleashed, all these different groups wanting, more freedom, more opportunity, more of what, the promise of the Mexican nation was about, will now can continue to compete for the period of roughly a decade until 1920.
So,
Cristobal, go ahead.
This is where I would like to ask, because I believe your ancestors actually fought in this war, yes?
Yes, they did. In Monterrey, the Garza family, there was actually my great-grandmother was one of the famous Adelitas, which, people that fought, women that fought in the revolution. Her father.
So it was your grandmother?
My great-grandmother, yes.
Now, I love this because it's fascinating to me how many women fought in that war.
Oh, yes. You think the cooking and the cleaning, but I mean, you had women that were fighting. You have pictures of women with the bullets out there, with pots out there, with Via. And as our dear professor was saying here, we have to take into account when Porfirio Diaz was in power, 80% of Mexican capital was in foreign hands. This was a betrayal of the dreams of Benito Juarez. This was a betrayal of the dreams of Father Hidalgo, of Father Morelos. It was completely beneath the dignity and the decency of the Mexican people to live in a situation essentially colonized in their own country by foreign interests. That we pushed the Spanish out, British imperialism, English imperialism, and American imperialism came in. The railroads controlled by the United States. In fact, the railroads were crafted from north to south, from south to north, essentially to take all the Mexican resources and shoot it up there. In the north, you get the mines. The mines were controlled by the British, by the United States. You see some mass strikes starting to happen right before the revolution. The factories starting to come up, controlled by foreign interests. So you really have people like my great-grandmother, Garza, Maria Garza, that really just felt, what is the essence of life? The essence of life, I think Emiliano Zapata coined it, got it very succinctly when he said tierra y libertad, land and liberty.
And we have to also touch on the fact that Diaz was a dictator. It wasn't like he was this great president. He was a dictator, and the people were making 25 cents a day from sun up to sunlight and being beaten. They didn't have freedom of speech. So it was terribly oppressive. I saw an interview where someone said it wasn't about pride or this or that. It was about necessity to live because they were like slaves. It was awful.
Oftentimes, Diana, you go to Mexican restaurants and you see a Mexican with their hat, with their big sombrero and then their poncho leaning over. It seems like that's a romantic, kind of a funny depiction of Mexicans, but that in fact was the reality of the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, because so few people had jobs, so few people had food, and even less people had land. So you had the poor people from just weakness and anemia just laying there with their sombreros here and their ponchos over them. No popular participation, no future, and no life.
So Justin, to give us a little context, art in that period was influenced by whom?
Well, like a lot of things, and even before Diaz, a lot of the culture was very Eurocentric because of the colonial history in Mexico. So a lot of the work was really elevated European classical ideals and really didn't even acknowledge, let alone celebrate folk or indigenous arts in Mexico. And it was this idea that you could see through architecture, through the arts. It was an emulation of Europe. I mean, it was a very colonial system.
So Cesáreo, during the rule of Diaz, then we have this transformation. We have 10 years of change and flux and overthrow and all these different groups that take over and fight. We had how many different presidents during this period? It's like several, right? There's several presidents that come into power and then get overthrown and come into power and get overthrown. And then we come into the change. So can you talk about this period now of all this tumultuousness and how we start to see this renaissance?
Sure. So as mentioned, the Eurocentric capital of Mexico City, it looked like Paris. It was much more European in every regard, and part of the Porfiriato, what they did was they would attend all the world expositions, including the one in Chicago in 1893. It was a very important thing to sort of put your country in light of modernity and prosperity. And so, the Porfiriato really emulated Eurocentric European art. And what happens is during the revolution, a few of the artists, especially the ones that are better known, like Diego Rivera, and then some of the other artists that would come back later, they were training in Europe at the time. They were in Paris, learning about Cubism, learning about all the modern art movements at the start of the 20th century. What happens is
can you give everybody context that's not in Cubism, like Picasso?
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay,
Exactly.
so people understand this was the art that was popular before.
Right. So that's what Diego Rivera would have been studying in Europe at the time, along with frescoes and European techniques of how to apply painted plaster onto walls. They were really absorbing and learning traditions from the European standard. What wound up by happening is under President Obregón, so we're talking about near the end of the Mexican Revolution, he sets up or establishes a minister of education. And this is a very important thing because it's the minister of education, Jose Vasconcelos, who writes this whole thesis about how to educate the masses. He realizes that education is key and it's fundamental for many things in society, but one of those things is nation building, building a Mexican national identity. He realizes because of his, he has a few good friends who are artists, and sometimes when we listen to the artists and their creativity and their creative ways of understanding, they really bring about new ideas. And so the idea of a Mexicanidad, that's a Mexicanness, an idea of a Mexicanidad really takes off. So the muralists start painting beautiful imagery that has to do with what it means to be Mexican. And they start with the indigenous that John was talking about. They start with the indigenous cultures. They celebrate the civilizations that had architecture and had religion and had everything that a true civilization has. Those get emblazoned on the walls and frescoes, and they get printed on paper with the printmakers. And the other thing to remember is that most people were illiterate at this time. And so the arts really become a way for them to envision and understand and embrace their roots and their history of who they are. A lot like the stained glass windows of medieval Europe, where people would sit and learn about the life of the saints and whatnot by sort of daydreaming while attending mass, daydreaming and seeing all those images. That's the way the murals, the frescoes, and the works on paper really worked in Mexico during this time period.
So during that period, Cesáreo, when they were these were commissioned by the government then.
That is correct.
That's important for people to understand that the government really was behind all this. It wasn't like the artists started it as much as the government really. Didn't they commission these?
They did. And, you could look at that movement, successful as it was, popular as it was, you could see it as propaganda. It was a way of really forging a united Mexican identity. It was creating one single narrative that went from the Aztecs all the way through to the revolution. And of course, the big heroes that you would then see in the murals would have been Emiliano Zapata, would have been Francisco Villa, and so many of the other people, the everyday people, all of a sudden were on the walls and celebrated along with their popular art traditions. So, and this is a very important key element here. The popular arts, the folk artists, and the fine artists really had a symbiotic relationship. They learned from one another, they worked together, and so what you end up with is a seamless visual understanding of Mexican identity, a single narrative that extends through to many of the immigrants that from Mexico who arrive in the United States. We bring that culture with us.
Do you think it's fair to say that it feels to me like it's the trademark of Mexican art that you still see it. You still see it on a plate. You still see it on a vase. You still see it wherever you go.
We have a saying in Mexico that tenemos el nopal en la frente, right? We have the cactus on our forehead, and we all recognize each other through that way. I think the nopal oftentimes is the culture. It's the imagery. It's the way we have designs, the woven designs from the Aztec temples that are now woven into women's garments, or the way that the colors, the bright colors of certain parts of Mexico are also equally a part of the abstract paintings of Oaxaca. So Mexico has this beautiful way of fusing together ancient and contemporary modern ideas, traditional ideas, all into one. And I think in Mexico, we don't see it necessarily as a mixture, but that is truly what it is. It's a mestizaje of cultural ideas and icons that come from ancient Native American civilizations, as well as European Christian. So it truly is a mixed bag.
Up until this time, and anybody can answer this, do you think art was accessible to everybody?
If I could get in, I don't think the way you would think. I mean, as it was pointed out by Cesáreo, we have mass illiteracy. The schools, the popular education, it wasn't there. Where my family's from in Monterrey, I mean, there was no healthcare, there was no education, there was no school. How can you talk about art, when you have none of these democratic conditions where art could stand? So, no, and I think, but it's always been in the Mexican soul. I mean, if you go to Mexico and you go to Tenochtitlan, you look at the pyramids, you go to Oaxaca, Monte Alban, you see the great works, Quetzalcoatl. I mean, it's just part of the Mexican essence to have this art. And quite similar to when, it's been pointed out that when Pancho Villa was getting onto the battlefield, he would raise 3 fingers. And immediately they would get into his men. They would get into singing the famous song Las Tres Pelonas, the three pelona. It was such, you see the lifting of oppression. You kind of think of the Hebrew people when they were escaping from Egypt, and they with Moses started to dance. I mean, this really shows when you get these oppressive political conditions, these oppressive social conditions off of you, and you unleash the latent forces inside the soul. I mean, this is what you see in Mexico, and you see a flowering of corridos, you see a flowering of didactic art, and if you go to Guadalajara, as I was a few years, I mean, you see the art everywhere. I mean, it's there. The poetry, there's a beautiful poetic tradition. There's so many sayings in Mexico, but really, I mean, I wouldn't see this coming alive if it wasn't for the Mexican Revolution. Trotsky once said that a new man needs a new poetry. And there could only exist a new poetry when there's new social conditions. And we really see how this came alive in the Mexican Revolution.
One thing I read, because of the women that were fighting in the revolution after the war was over, that there was a group of women who would learn the traditional dances from all over, and they did them in the square in Mexico City and brought them all together and started sharing these dances that they learned as they were fighting these wars. And I thought it was a really interesting story about how they were learning dances in the middle of this war and sharing their culture along the way.
One more important fact that was brought up a couple of times or touched on during the Porfiriato, Porfirio Diaz, in making Mexico a modern nation, he put the railroads in, as John mentioned, from north to south. And so as these trains went in and the revolution broke out, it was the first time that many people left their homes. So oftentimes you would be born and you would, live your life, excuse me, and you would pass away in the same town. And so you knew your traditions. You knew how your people made your food or your ceramics or your woven tapestries. During the revolution, because of the trains, Mexicans were able to travel across the country in the war, of course, and they observed other parts of Mexico, and they learned, this is how you make mole. We make mole different. This is how you make your ceramics. We make it a little bit different. And so they really sort of exchanged a lot of ideas, and Mexico for the first time was able to see itself and really share and change ideas that later on helped form this Mexican identity, this Mexicanidad. The trains really were able to sort of allow Mexicans to understand themselves like never before. And when you talk about art and culture, that art and culture, that mezcla, that mixing of people who live by the ocean versus the ones who live up in the northern deserts, they were able to see similarities and really help understand who they were. So the revolution, not only artistically and culturally, but also physically, was allowed Mexicans to understand who they were for the first time.
So let's talk about Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. I'd like to see, how did they come into this mix, and how did they impact this movement?
I think with Frida, I mean, she grew up amongst, right, the revolution. So she was born in 1907, but 3 years later, you have the official beginning of the revolution. In fact, she would later sometimes change her birth date to 1910 to correspond with the revolution. So she grew up surrounded by that. But then when you think about when she started going to the National Preparatory School, this was 2 years after the end of the revolution. And the Ministry of Education had really worked intensely with schools to not only build new schools, to change their curriculum, but they were also bringing these artists in, bringing these intellectuals in. And that kind of energy and excitement and this cross-pollinization that Cesáreo was talking about, and this joy that Cristobal was saying was happening. So this kind of renaissance of ideas and art was happening. And it was also drawing in artists from around the world who were beginning to experience the beginnings of fascism and the Great Depression. So this is where Frida is going to school, right? And she's in a group of friends, Las Cachucas, who are very focused on these issues. They pride themselves on being intellectuals and very artistic. So she's in this conversation, right? At the same time, there are people being sent to her school to paint murals, namely Diego Rivera. And there's a lot of different stories about how the two met. And one of them is that her and her friends were playing pranks on Diego Rivera as he was trying to paint the mural at the National Preparatory School, or spying on him while he was, really enjoying one of his models. So she was in that moment. And then obviously, this was even before she began to be an artist. So then, after she had her fateful bus accident and was recovering and began painting and sought out these artists and was brought into their circle, she met people like Tina Modati, an Italian photographer who was in Mexico. She was introduced to Diego, and she was brought into these circles, and these ideas were introduced. And that tied in with her history, the knowledge that she gained working with her father, a photographer, really infused itself in its work. But where her work is a little different is that when you have the big three muralists like Diego Rivera or Roscoe Siqueiros, a lot of the work they're known for the time was very tied in with that kind of art for all movement of these amazing murals about unifying a diverse and rich country. Hers were much more personal, right? But at the same time, the palette, the figure she represented, her definitely her representation and pride in her history was fed by that revolution. I would also argue something else that, to Cesareo's point, which I think is very true, you could very easily look at this program as propaganda, because they were like, here's the line, this is what we're selling. I think that the reason, in my opinion, why so many of the artists kind of rose above that skill-wise is because the work they made was not just flatly telling the story. One, a lot of them were very deeply invested in this story and in this experiment. But also they were telling a visual story of a history in a way that wasn't talking down to the public, but elevating them, not just through what the story is, but through the experimentation, precision, and skill of the work itself. I mean, when you stand in front of a Rivera mural, you may not know the history, but the kind of grandeur of it as a piece of art is elevating to you as an audience. And through that, and coming through the revolution, I think it requires of an artist to be precise in what you're saying, convicted, and direct. And those are all aspects I would say also are in Frida Kahlo's work.
If I could add something too, to kind of touch on what you said and what Cesáreo said. As far as education is concerned, the history during Porfiriato and even all the way back to the conquest, education was really reserved for a very small elite group at the top, and it was controlled by the Catholic Church. There was really no meaningful national or even local free public education. That's one of the great achievements of the Mexican Revolution. And so the Ministry of Education, as Cesáreo pointed out, was one of the great achievements of the revolution, and Frida was right at the hub of that. On top of that, we can also say the fact she was a woman. Even for those elites in the old days that were the only ones that could get an education, it was primarily males. Now, there were certainly a number of very strong women that were able to gain access to education, and indigenous and mestizo people that gained an education, like Benito Juarez, for example, but they were relatively few and far between. So what happens after the Mexican Revolution, there's this opportunity, and Frida is at the hub of this new opportunity for women, for people of mixed heritage, for people who in a previous age would have not had the access to education or seeing the world of art, including Diego Rivera.
But Frida, even though women were allowed, she was one of 35 women out of 2,000 in that school. So even though they let women in, it's not like they opened the floodgates. It was like, you 30 can come in,
Yeah, in that school, yeah.
Even Diana, even earlier in her career, she was known as Diego's wife, so even though she's making what are now some of her most iconic paintings, she definitely still suffered from what a lot of women in all fields in the 20th century suffered for, where she was definitely thrown in the shadow. And Diego was a big, tall, fat man and a big shadow, so I think that continued for quite some time. And it wasn't until later, after periods of separation, where she started to identify her own career with shows in New York and Europe, that she started to step outside of that shadow.
To your point, to this day, the older generation still looks at Diego as more of the, my own mother, when this all started and we were doing the Frida show, my mom goes, honey, you got it wrong. She was born in 1925. She goes, Diego Rivera is the artist. She was just his wife. That's from a woman, right?
Times if I could just chime in real quick. Times have really changed. Times have really, really changed. And one of the beautiful fertilities, I think, in forming both Diego and Frida was, and we have to remember, we can't forget the working class conscious. I think before you get the Mexican Revolution, there was no class conscious. There was you were a noble in how white you were, or you were an Indian and how dark you were, and but when you get informed by the ideas of Marx, by Peter Kropotkin, the anarchist, by Flores Magón. I don't think we talk enough about Flores Magón and his influence on the Mexican, his anarchism. He was the one who first said land and liberty, the core of a revolution. You can't speak of a revolution with a straight face if you're not giving land to the peasants, if the peasants are not taking the land back. So the working class consciousness in both Diego and Frida, along with this new mestizaje, the celebration of the Native American, the celebration of the Native Mexican. Even in Frida's, as personal as she got, she never strayed too far away from being a working class artist, and also being an artist, a mestizo artist, who was being informed by the thousands, the millennial history of Mesoamerica, the Aztecs and the Mayans, and you get this deep, the Zapotecas and the Mixteca. You have this beautiful well that extends so deep here, and you see in the Mexican Revolution these forces starting to come alive, and you see that in the art of Frida Kahlo. That was like I didn't see. It's like nothing before her, but she had that audacity, and I really think that audacity came from a profound sense of hope from this new participation. Mexico was participating, as my dear brother Cesáreo mentioned, like never before, And we also might, you talked about the railroads bringing people to different parts of Mexico. That's super important. We also have to think about the first factories coming up under the Porfiriato. They were owned by the British and the French and the Americans, but they were still bringing people from Oaxaca together, from people from Nueva León, where my family's from, people from Sonora, together with people from Sinaloa, and people from Colima for the first time. So there was this beautiful cross-fertility. It's a big country, I mean, there's so much going on here, but in the Mexican Revolution, you see what's been called by the French an orgasm of history.
So let's fast forward to how this movement not just only impacted Mexican art and culture, but how did it impact the rest of, because we have to remember, so this is what's going on here in Mexico, but we also have the Depression, World War II, that's going on during this time, right? That's happening during this. And then, so now, how did this or did it influence, would you say? What would you argue, that it had an influence other than Mexico? Because I feel it did. So I'm curious to hear if you feel it did.
I feel that absolutely it did. I think initially in the early years, Obregón even intentionally, he levied a one-time tax against the wealthy in the country to send this to put on this exhibition that then traveled to Los Angeles that highlighted Native Mexican art, and it kind of set a fire of people interested in this kind of work. But then beyond that, once there was aware of what was happening in Mexico City, that Renaissance, not only did you have artists, Mexican artists returning, you had other artists starting to come through and visit to take part in this amazing cultural mix that was happening. And they were seeing what was being made, and they were being greatly influenced. And so then in the government, a lot of the government funding for these murals started to dry up. So some of these artists had to start to leave Mexico to start to make a living. So you have Orozco going to California to paint a mural, and his mural Prometheus, that he made in 1930 at Pomona College, was viewed by artists like Jackson Pollock. Okay, the kind of it is unbelievable how they came. Then you have Diego come, right? Diego come, and he's in San Francisco, in Detroit, in New York, a time in Philadelphia, and then Frida's with him. They're interacting with all the artists of the country. They're seeing this work. They're seeing the energy, this kind of this newness of the work. And I think that starts to influence country, like art across the world, but definitely in the United States, because I think art, like so many things in our country, we are so intrinsically tied together as two countries, Mexico and the United States. I mean, half of our country used to be part of Mexico.
Exactly.
So much of our culture is drawn from Mexico. So when I think about when Siqueiros was in New York, he started the experimental workshop. When you think about the artists going through that workshop, you have Jackson Pollock, okay? And when you have that workshop, and in the workshop, artists are being encouraged to experiment with materials, paint on the floor, use their cigarette butts in the paint. Is it any surprise not too many years later, Jackson Pollock is pouring paint on a canvas, giving birth to one of the largest movements in US painting history, abstract expressionism? Absolutely not. That is a direct line from not only the revolution, but these artists. And then you think about just the nature of large scale figurative work in this country, whether it's mural, narrative work. You know, it's no surprise to me that in contemporary times, major street art movements come out of California, San Francisco, LA. You know why? Because a lot of the remnants, these murals don't go away, are still in that area. So these are kids who grew up maybe going to community college in San Francisco, seeing a Diego Rivera.
And that's what I was trying to say, was before this revolution, the only people who went to see art were the rich who could go to the museums. It wasn't in the streets. So this sort of like unleashed this creative artistic license to say to people, I think even if you weren't, let's say you were not commissioned to do a piece of art, but now as a young kid, I mean, and look at Frida, I mean, that's a very extreme example, but how many young children that never became a great artist were inspired by just seeing this art and starting to paint, and it kind of gives you a license to do it. And I don't care who you are, if you're an adult, when you see a chalk artist, you want to do it. It makes you want to go home and doodle, you know? And I think that it unleashed this permission to be creative.
You know, and also in the United States, we have the WPA murals program where artists were commissioned to go into schools to go into post offices
Yes.
and courthouses and government buildings and really sort of embellish the walls with frescoes of scenes of Americana, right?
Yes.
And that was a direct influence from the muralist movement in Mexico. There were many artists from the United States, African American, women artists, artists who felt disenfranchised here in this country would go down to Mexico, would work with the printmakers and the muralists, and then came back to the United States and really developed a language that was readable here in this country, but had a lot of the ideas of art for the people, art as educational, as didactic.
And also, like, I think, like you were saying, it almost taught pride. It taught national pride. And you know what's interesting? I just read an article right here in the Glen Ellen Post Office is one of those murals. That's really interesting.
Diane, I just want to say to everyone watching, I know we can't all travel right now, but there's still this excellent show up at the Whitney Museum called Vida Americana, and it's exactly about this issue we're talking about, and it draws direct lines from it's a heavy focus on the muralists, but how this work coming out of Mexico at that time directly influenced American artists and culture.
So I want to ask, to me, the most recent expression of murals and art that is political and passionate is the art that's on the wall that Trump's building. And I think it's fascinating that the Mexican people have taken something that can be seen as so oppressive and so imposing and turned it into this incredible work of art.
I was just going to say, I mean, yeah, you see it says Vasconcelos put on the Museum of Art, through may the spirit, move through my people. I mean, the art is a movement of the spirit in our time. Art is a movement of the soul of a people penetrating history here. And you get the Mexican Revolution, and talking about the influence. I mean, the new demands of a revolution put new demands on art. Where before a revolution, and you see this in other countries, you see a self-absorbed art, and art's about me and my personality and, Freud or whatever. But then you get a revolution and it just unleashes the potential of a people. And when you're an oppressed people, even more. And you're going to see this again in 1917, inspired by the Mexican Revolution, the revolution in Russia, where the art just came alive, from lyric peasant poetry to a real beautiful art of Kandinsky, you name it. You see this again in Algiers, when they took the French shackles off of them. You see this in Nicaragua with the beautiful music in the Sandinista Revolution, inspired by the Mexican Revolution. And you see this again in Cuba in 1959 when the U.S. client puppetry of Bautista, the dictator, was taken off the people. And again, the revolution inspired by the Mexican Revolution, the subsequent art here, freed from the shackles of the bourgeoisie and really expressing a beautiful working class consciousness and an indigenismo or a mestizaje, as we would say in Latin America. So you really see that beautiful fertility of the Mexican Revolution. And it's still alive today, as you say. You're taking this ugly wall here and you're humanizing, you're asserting your dignity there. That in spite of this wall, I am a human being and I deserve dignity and decency. And this wall, kind of like the Berlin Wall, is going to be coming down soon.
One thing I love about everyone's organization, from Immigrant Solidarity DuPage to what you do, Cesáreo, at the Mexican Museum of Art, to even John, what you do in your class. I love how culture is used to act, to be activists, how culture is used to educate, and how culture is used, well, obviously in art. But I think it's interesting, Cristobal, that much of what you do, I know that you advocate for rights and you do wonderful work, but you do a lot of creative projects for the people. And I'm wondering, it kind of shows the power of the art still, how lasting it is, and why do you both use arts and events? And I look at our Frida Fest we did at the MAC, 5,000 people came. on a rainy day. And it just warmed my heart, to see the celebration and the love and the excitement, just the excitement, and how many people thanked us for doing it. And it was very, very exciting. And I feel like, we do have a Frida Kahlo exhibition coming in 2021. And that's how I've met all these wonderful people and what inspired this talk. But I think the more we can educate throughout this year about this beautiful culture, this beautiful heritage, the beautiful art, and celebrate it. And I know Cesáreo will be having several events. So Cesáreo, can you give a plug of where they can follow your events?
Yes, of course. Thank you. So we're on the website of National Museum of Mexican Art. It's all one word. And we're getting ready to open up our Day of the Dead exhibition on Friday. It'll be opening virtually from 6 until 8 o'clock. And we'll have live streaming. We'll have a few pre-recorded interviews with artists. And as always, with Day of the Dead, we always have artwork in there that honors and pays tributes to those who are no longer with us. But then there's also works of art that really are very political. There are pieces in there that talk about the ecology and the pollution in the Little Village neighborhood. There are other ones that talk about LGBTQ rights, and there's some that talk about the police and what's happening across the country. So art is always a place where creative people express themselves. And of course, the best expressions are always the ones that have the most emotion, whether it's you're fed up and angry and just basically saying this needs to stop now, or celebrating somebody who is no longer around or somebody that you love dearly. And so oftentimes the arts, they do become a catalyst. They do become a way of expressing, just like a poem does, like a song does, like a book does. So it makes sense that the arts are always part of every protest. The arts are always a part of every movement. And so it's just a natural. They fit. You need creative people at the table. You need creative people who are going to help get your message across clearly, effectively, and creatively.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. John, do you have any classes coming up that people can sign up for that you want to plug and tell them about?
Certainly. I teach Latin American history every spring semester. So this upcoming spring, the course catalog will be released in the not too distant future, and it's History 2240. Just look for it at the College of DuPage catalog, and when you sign up for my class, History 2240.
We'll get to learn all. I mean, I think this story of the Mexican Revolution should be the next miniseries. It makes Ozark look like it's standing still. I mean, it is. The characters are awesome. It's just such an interesting part of history.
I wanted to add one quick thing before we move on, but we referenced a few times before Mexicanidad, which is sort of a Mexican version of what I like to call inclusivity. And that's something that I think makes Frida so appealing to so many different groups worldwide. You asked earlier about the global appeal. And what is more empowering, and culturally speaking, than, say, someone living in a somewhat remote indigenous community in Morelos or the Zacatecas or some other area that's in central or southern Mexico, and having your culture, having your art, and not being recognized, being told that this is less than, that the real art is something that's imported from Europe during Porfiriato. And then the revolution, and then Diego and Frida will highlight that in the murals and her artwork and give them equal standing, equally beautiful. And that is one of the most beautiful aspects of the artistic side of the revolution, and one of the reasons I'm so such a devotee of Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. So I just wanted to add that in. It's inclusivity, and what better message for today, right?
Cristobal, we're doing a collaboration soon for you. We're going to do a Day of the Dead drive-by and ask people to bring a donation of food for Immigrant Solidarity DuPage. I know you've been doing tireless work to help the Latino community who's really struggling from this COVID. And I've been to a couple of the events, and what you're doing is really heartwarming and powerful. So thank you for what you're doing. And if people want to follow some of your work, how can they follow and help?
They could go to our website, immigrantsolidaritypage.org. And also they could follow us on Facebook. We have a very active Facebook page. And yeah, I mean, the core of our group, we're an immigrant rights organization, but we include the immigrant rights culture and community. And really, when you have an oppressed culture, when you have an oppressed people, our base is undocumented, our base is afraid of raids, our base is working at minimum wage, our base is hurt on the job, our base are women, facing their own issues here. And when we get these cultural events, we really try to get the spirit to revive. They call the Latinos, they call us a sleeping giant. But as our dear brother Cesáreo knows, if you get the culture in there, you start to kind of like to stoke the embers a little bit of the soul of a people. And that's why we have these events. Francois Truffaut, the French filmmaker, said, you have reality, and then you have art, which is a more noble part of reality here. And that art, it gives us a new synthesis, a new look and reality, a new sensibility, and that's really what we're trying to do in our community, to raise that level of sensibility here, of how we look at the world, how we feel the world, how we experience the world, and that's why we bring the culture into the struggle.
And Justin, can you tell everybody where they can follow about Frida Kahlo coming and the work that you're doing with CCMA?
Sure. All information about Frida, to sign up for the newsletter, to get tickets, because they are on sale now, you can go to frida2021.org. And if you want to follow what we're doing at the museum, we're doing a lot of virtual programming. We just launched our Visiting Artist series. Our next one will be October 15th with the MacArthur Award recipient, Trevor Paglin. All of that can be found at theccma.org. You can look under Visiting Arts Talks or check out our CCMA Create series.
And at the McAninch Art Center, you can follow us at themac.org. We have lots of programming, some free, some paid. We cover not only the Cleve Carney Museum of Art, but we cover college theater, college music, college dance. And we also have a touring series, and we're doing some virtual programming, and we're just trying to get creative, and we're doing things like this incredible talk. Now, for all of you watching at home, I have not forgotten about you, and I have your questions here. So from Lisa Reyes, she wants to know, what role did the Adelitas play in the war? Who can answer that in a minute or less?
I could take it. My great grandmother was a Adelita.
Oh,
so I mean, they fought.
Go.
I mean, I think a lot of people try to regulate women as the cooks or the cleaners, but they were actually out there fighting. They believed in the essence of the revolution, land and liberty, and they were out there fighting. And you can go listen to the song Las Adelitas. All of the beautiful corridos that have been written about them. But I mean, it's really talking about feminism. I mean, that's just women taking the reins of their destiny and saying, all right, I'm gonna forget it, let the oligarchy do their thing. We're gonna grab this horse here and we're gonna steer it. And that's what they did, taking up arms.
Wasn't there one who disguised herself as a man for many years, and then they found out she was a woman and she was like a general?
Yeah, that was
yes.
John?
Emilio Avila was a woman who was a very skilled commander and soldier through the entire war, fought with the Zapatistas, with Emiliano Zapata, and she disguised herself as a man.
That's
and
it.
Disguise is the wrong word. She actually identified as a man for the rest of her life. Many believe her to be a true transgender heroine or hero in the Mexican Revolution. He lived to be 95 years old. He only died in the 1980s, and he's been given all the honors that he was due back in the Revolution.
Now, on the flip side of the coin, I heard that Pancho Villa said he liked that the women came along and fought with them because the guys didn't want to go home to their wives. They were okay to stay and keep going because their wives were with them. So we have another question from Lisa. Is that when the Katrina started showing up in art? So I don't know when the question was, but does anyone know when the Katrina, Cesáreo?
Yeah, the Katrina was started by Posada. Jose Guadalupe Posada was a printmaker, very popular printmaker, but during his lifetime, nobody knew him. No one knew his name. And so he was the gentleman who would sort of illustrate magazines and newspapers, but without a name and recognition, as you could imagine. He came up with a Catrina, I believe it was in 1911, and it was a way of depicting a wealthy woman with a fancy hat, Parisian style hat. And it was a way of sort of saying that even though you're wealthy here on earth, even though you have all the riches that you believe are riches, you will end up the same way as everybody else. Death is being the great equalizer. Now, then Diego Rivera, in his mural at the Alameda Park, which it's still there. It wasn't a hotel. The hotel fell down during an earthquake, but they saved the mural. He includes La Catrina, and he includes an image of Jose Guadalupe Posada as sort of like a shout out, as a way of acknowledging this popular artist. And then after that, the Catrina really does sort of take off as a symbol again of the wealthy individuals and equalizing the social strata, sort of the caste system that John was talking about, that continued to exist into the 20th century. To a certain extent, it was no longer categorized that way, but it still was an oppressive society. So the Catrina really takes off after the painting at the Alameda. So it would have been in the second half of the 20th century when the Catrina really becomes an icon that she is today. That's sort of it in a short story.
Thank you. This is from Mario. Mario asks, he said, I'd love to talk about the railroads, the Industrial Revolution, and its connection to art. Could you speak to the role of photo and film as it emerged? Anybody? Well, all I know is that Pancho Villa made a deal with the movie, the film industry to...
Yeah. Agustin Casasola and Hugo Breme were two photographers. They were like the Brady, what Brady is to the Civil War in the United States. These two gentlemen were sort of the documentarians of the Mexican Revolution, and they traveled everywhere, and they took photographs of everyday people, of the Adelitas. There's some iconic photographs of Adelitas, and then also the wealthy people. So these photographers really documented both sides, or I should say all sides of the revolution, because at some point there was more than two, more than three. But those are the photographs, and of course photography was sort of it wasn't brand new, but photography on the spot photography with the large format glass negatives. It was tricky, and it was a new technology that took off just in sync there with the Mexican Revolution.
Okay, and our last question is from Marcy Peterson. She said, what role did Diego and Frida play in enticing many of us to be so engaged in embracing the art world? That's a tough one.
I can't speak for everybody, but I would say, for myself, when I was a young student, I went to art school knowing I wanted to be creative. And the first artist I discovered was actually Diego Rivera. And for me to see that kind of direct storytelling and passion and the scale really pushed me towards the fine arts. And I think at different levels, both of those artists have both an accessibility balanced by the complexity of the completion and the honesty of expression that reach and speak to a lot of people. And when it comes to Frida, it could be on so many different levels, whether it is her cultural heritage, whether it is her struggles with having children, whether it is her disability that she dealt with her entire life. She laid it all out on the canvases. She shared it, and there's something about having someone be open in such a vulnerable way that can't help but touch a viewer, because we all have these experiences, but we don't always have the voice to speak to them. So I think for Frida, that's absolutely one of the reasons.
I just wanted to say, you almost see like two revolutions going on with Diego and with Frida. With Diego, you see the external revolution painted on the wall. You know, it's the honesty, the raw honesty of the Indian, of the worker, you know, of industrial capitalism, of the oligarchs in Mexico. And in Frida, you see that revolution turned inward, you know, this raw honesty, putting paint in the landscapes of the soul, you know, in such a raw and crude way, almost sometimes, I mean, a disturbing way if you've seen some of her arts. But, you know, I think that's where you get the likability factor. I mean, they were brave, you know, they were strong, and they were honest here, and they were gonna paint that reality as they saw it, you know, influenced by indigenismo, influenced by working class consciousness, influenced by the ideals of a revolution. You know, I think we don't have that very much in art, that a completely new world is possible. And they felt that very, very from the soul. And I think that just having that sentiment unleashed so many forces that were within them. And that's where you see on those canvases, that's what you see when you go to Guadalajara in Mexico City, on those frescoes.
You know, one time I did a talk and a little girl said, I love Frida because she really painted her feelings. And I'm like, well, that says it all, right? They were able to paint their feelings, and Diego painted his feelings. And I think when somebody's really honest and authentic, that's when they're relatable. And I think that both of them had a true authenticity that was appealing to so many on so many different levels. I think I could talk to all of you all night long, but our time is up, and I cannot thank you enough. What a thrill it was to have you all in the same Zoom instead of room, and to share this time and to talk about this wonderful piece of history. And thank you for your friendship. Thank you for your collaboration. And thanks everybody at home for listening. This is a great way to kick off Latino Heritage Month. And I hope that you celebrate by, I don't know, what do you think they should do, Cesáreo?
I think people should have some delicious Mexican food, but also remember those essential workers, many of them who are undocumented and who have to still go out there regardless of the COVID or whatnot, and make things happen for us so that we can have food in our stores and our refrigerators and Amazon and all that stuff. So yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else have any closing remarks?
I want to thank you, Diana, for facilitating this, and thank you to these wonderful gentlemen I'm meeting for the first time, but I hope we stay in touch. It was a pleasure to do all of your wonderful insights.
Thank you all, and thanks to everybody watching at home, and happy Latino Heritage Month. Stay safe, everybody. Bye-bye.
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
Adelante. Buenas noches. Que estén bien, amigos. Hasta luego, Cesáreo. Que estén bien. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Justin. We'll see you later.